Travelling on America's first railways could be a very different experience from travelling in Europe. The first carriages typically consisted of converted stagecoaches or open trucks with seats and cover installed. They were so lightweight that they would frequently slip off the track, whereupon passengers could be drafted into picking them up and putting them back in place. However, longer journeys demanded something more substantial, and it wasn't long before recognisable boxcars and carriages took shape, fully enclosed to keep out the smoke and the weather. They were placed on double bogies, which allowed longer carriages to handle tighter bends. This created a smoother ride for passengers, and also allowed companies to run trains of the same capacity but with fewer carriages, greatly reducing rolling resistance. Unlike most European coaches, American coaches were open plan right from the start. The longer journeys required passengers to be able to move around for their own comfort. It also allowed them to visit the toilet. Toilet stalls became commonplace in American carriages much sooner than European ones. Nonetheless, journeys were far from comfortable. The seats were bare wood, primitive braking systems made starting and stopping very abrupt, ventilation came from opening a window, heating came from a single stove in the middle of the carriage. Those who wished for a bit of fresh air could step out onto the balconies at either end of the coach. These were equipped with sets of steps for boarding and exiting the train. It was a necessary feature, as early platforms were rarely built at carriage level. More typically, they were an ankle-high platform designed mainly to keep people's feet out of the mud. In many places, there would be no platform at all. Travellers would simply flag trains down on the slower sections of the line. There were no facilities to eat or sleep on early carriages, so special rest stops would be scheduled into the journey to cater to these needs. Hotels would be built on otherwise unoccupied sections of tracks, purely to allow trains to be unloaded for overnight stops, a common requirement in a country as vast as the US. But schedules were often unreliable in the early days, and trains couldn't always reach the planned overnight stops in time. The crew would just stop at the nearest town and leave passengers to seek their own accommodation. Another feature missing in comparison to Britain was any formalised class system. Those with money could pay for a carriage to themselves, but it was a private arrangement, and companies rarely offered designated first and second class tickets. Right from the start, travel would be one size fits all. Of course, US railways did possess one strict divide, and that was race. Even in the supposedly free North, black people would frequently be blocked from sharing carriages with whites. Often, they would be provided with no carriages at all, and would have to travel as best they could in the boxcars and luggage cars. The coming of the railways was a source of a great deal of excitement everywhere they went. Towns which had once been linked only by dirt roads and ancient trails were now opened up to new opportunities. Communication across this vast continent was vastly sped up. Goods could be transported in a fraction of the time and the cost of moving them by road. And while canals were still cheaper, they were much slower. What's more, they would often freeze over in the winter, whereas the railways were easier to keep going in any conditions. Speeding up communication was a great boost to the economy. Farmers, miners and craftspeople had access to a much wider market than they'd had before. Individuals too, who had previously been confined to one town for their whole lives, could make use of these new lines to seek education and opportunities elsewhere. The railways also made it much easier to supply remote areas, greatly boosting settlement. At the start of the century, settlers had moved little beyond the original 13 colonies. Now the first great drive westward was happening, with railways greatly speeding things up. Industrialisation too was sped up, with factories gaining access to the steady supply of raw materials they would need, an easy method of transporting them to the docks and the markets, as well as the ability to recruit workers from much wider areas. As the industry grew, the country's dependence on materials imported from Britain would rapidly decrease. The excitement surrounding the railways was seemingly contagious. More than 200 rail companies sprang up across the country in this time, plotting lines here and there. Their funding came from a variety of means. The American ideal was that they should be privately financed, but in practice, railways could rarely be purely private affairs. Railways are generally unprofitable to run and provide little direct return to attract investors. Their main selling point is the boost they bring to the local economy. For this reason, funding typically consisted of a mix of private investment and state subsidies. The government in Washington could have provided aid, but the states were suspicious about the concept of direct government intervention. Nonetheless, the government found ways to help out indirectly, such as passing acts promising a remission of import duties of iron imported from Britain, an act which would ultimately be scrapped in 1843 when American iron became more readily available. A more ubiquitous incentive the government could offer was land. Railways were being built through a lot of sparsely populated areas, particularly since the natives had recently been cleared out in the Trail of Tears. A corridor of land close to the line could easily be awarded to the company as valuable real estate. The first land grant was set up for the Tallahassee Railroad Company in Florida in 1835, awarding them 30 feet 9 meters on either side of the line. This land was sold to settlers, with entire towns built in the middle of nowhere. Not only did the company make direct money off the sale of land, but these towns created an extra market for the rail to transport. Once funding was secured, construction could get underway. Whereas British companies depended on dedicated teams and navvies to get their lines built who would move with the company, American companies would grab any cheap source of labour from the surrounding area, with the expectation that they would learn on the job. The inexperienced workforce and lack of health and safety procedures meant that accidents and fatalities were quite common. Not only did they have to deal with standard accidents, but the wilder terrain meant dealing with wild animals, harsh weather and tropical disease. Companies would use the cheapest source of labour available. In the north, this usually consisted of migrants, who would often be recruited straight off the ships. In the south, they had ready access to slave labour. By the time of the Civil War, there were 15,000 slaves working on the railways. The rail companies saw little reason to purchase the slaves and simply rented them from their owners for 1 or 2 year contracts. Contracts they would frequently not survive. Conditions were far worse than for their comrades on the plantations. They were forced to work extra long hours in back-breaking conditions in the hot sun. Alongside workplace accidents, there was the issue of accommodation. They were poorly fed and poorly housed, with shelter rarely consisting of more than tents, sometimes not even that. An observer on the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad described slave accommodation as consisting of a wooden pen with poles holding up a cover. Slaves were kept there with no solid walls, no floor, no beds, no chimney, and no cooking utensils. In these cramped conditions, scarlet fever, malaria, and cholera were rife. Knowing how bad conditions were, some owners refused to lease out their slaves for fear of depleting their own workforce. The companies solved this issue by creating insurance policies. If a slave died, the owners would be nicely compensated for their loss of earnings. Employing slave labour was not the only corner-cutting measure employed to get the railways built as quickly and cheaply as possible. The majority of routes were single-tracked, with passing loops built in at intervals. This required trains to arrive at these loops at the correct times to pass each other by. The problem was, with little communication over long distances, any disruption in the schedules could be quite chaotic. For the staff at each station and junction, their knowledge of what was happening down the line was limited to their line of sight. Often, they would build crow's nests or station lookouts on high vantage points to scan the horizon for signs of smoke. A delayed train could leave those coming the other way waiting all day at a passing loop for a train which might never arrive. On other occasions, they would move on without waiting, believing they could get to the next passing loop first, only to encounter the oncoming train in the middle of the track, leaving the crews to argue about who would have to reverse through a long stretch of track to the next loop. Whereas in Britain, lines were built to be as straight and level as possible, American lines were primarily built to follow contours, weaving around hills and obstructions, rarely building embankments, simply following the ground where it lay. By 1850, though the length of the network in America was 3 times higher than in Britain, the length of rail tunnel in Britain was 7 times higher. Of course, deep gullies were harder to bypass than hills. Engineers rapidly learned the art of building wooden trestle bridges, which would become a staple of 19th century American railways. Due to the varying quality of wood and the slightly imprecise nature of structural engineering at the time, these bridges had to be heavily over-engineered to give plenty of margin of error. Though secure, they could bounce and sway alarmingly as a train passed over them, but they fulfilled an important purpose in getting the network built quickly at a time when wood was the only building material available in such high quantities. The steeper gradients and wider routes demanded engines more suitable for this environment. Early American railways were primarily dependent on locomotives imported from Britain. But as industry grew in America, engine manufacturing took off, now tailored for the American network. In 1837, Henry R. Campbell of the Germantown and Norristown Railway designed the world's first 440 locomotive, which was constructed at the Baldwin Locomotive Works. The extra set of drive wheels allowed it to pull trains of 450 tons, 63% more than the best of Baldwin's 420 locomotives. However, Campbell's locomotive proved impractical. Its rigid frame and poor suspension made it prone to coming off the track. Manufacturers Garnett and Eastwick improved on these designs with their own engine known as Hercules. The lead wheels were placed on a separate truck, which pivoted independently, allowing it to handle tighter bends. To improve traction further, they employed 3-point suspension. The wheels were divided into 3 groups, with each held on a separate frame, designed so that any loss of grip on one wheel would transfer the weight to another. The 3 groups of wheels were attached to the main frame at a single point each, allowing it to sit on the 3 points of contact which make up a plane. 440 trains like Hercules did a great deal to improve the power and reliability of locomotives, capable of handling the gradients and bends of America's lines. These would soon become informally known as American Standard locomotives, a design which would dominate the network for the next few decades. Over the course of the 1840s, railways more than tripled in length. Looking at a map, it could appear as though a network was nicely shaping up, but the reality on the ground was far from it. And this largely stemmed from the way the railways were organised. Lines in Britain required an Act of Parliament to be built, meaning that there was a central authority overseeing everything right from the start, with the expectation that the scattered companies would ultimately link to form a cohesive network. American companies, on the other hand, were overseen by state governments, and each company saw themselves as a separate entity. Even where they met, there was little effort to connect their lines. Travelling any great distance would require a lot of time spent disembarking the train, walking to a station on the other side of town, and joining a new train. The lack of coordination was displayed in the gauges of the tracks. While some effort was made by the companies to match their gauge to the companies around them, a company in Georgia would have little reason to worry about what a company in Maine was doing. By 1850, there were at least 6 different gauges of tracks on the main line, creating an impenetrable break of gauge wherever they met. But this break was more than welcome to most. Where companies met, town planners would deliberately place their stations on either side of town. For the companies, this eliminated the supposed competition the other company would bring. For locals, the long gap between the stations would require travellers to spend time walking through town, hopefully spending some money along the way. For most, the idea of a national network was not wanted. Each state saw themselves as an independent entity. The railways they were commissioning were purely to cater to the state's need. Some states even passed legislation forbidding rail companies from crossing the border. Nonetheless, plans were underway to reform this approach, and it would not take long for stronger, long-distance travel lines to emerge. But that is a story for next time. Thank you all for watching. If you are enjoying this series so far, please leave a comment to let me know. And why not like, share and subscribe to stay updated. I hope to start working on part 3 of this series soon. However, before that, I am working on a special episode about the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which I will be releasing on its 200th anniversary in a couple of months' time, so look out for that. If you are looking for some cool merchandise to celebrate 200 years of rail travel, why not check out my new merch store, where I have a number of t-shirts, mugs and posters available, featuring my drawings. Links to all of this down below. Which drawings would you like to see accessorized? Let me know in the comments. If you would like to support this channel in other ways, you can check out my website and my Etsy pages, links in the description. Or you can leave a donation on my Ko-fi page or here on YouTube. Goodbye for now.